I didn't mean to start. Did you just start the webinar?
I think you did.
I just, um, it's strange that you're not allowed. Can't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to turn your video on. You should have.
Oh,
Oh,
oh, is that it? I might just move because the light isn't very good just here.
hi everybody. Thanks for joining. We're just getting set up, and then we'll get going. Okay, while Fiona's just finding a good lighting spot there, I'll just say a few words of introduction. So, a very warm welcome to everybody to this, which is our first webinar of National Mammal Week 2024. I'm Matt Larson-Daw. I'm the CEO of the Mammal Society. This webinar will be recorded. The video will be available later this week to everyone that registered and others, since it's a free webinar. It would be lovely if you could use the chat function to just introduce yourself and say where you're dialing in from. However, if you've got any questions for Fiona, rather than dropping them in the chat, if you can use the Q&A box, which you should find in the middle of your Zoom settings. I will keep an eye on chat in case anyone has any trouble and that ends up being where they put their question. And we'll cover as many of those as possible at the end. So just by way of introduction, I've mentioned National Mammal Week, which this is the first day of this year. This is actually our 25th National Mammal Week. The Mammal Society started it in 1999 as an opportunity to just celebrate mammals and to shine a spotlight on mammal conservation and the issues that mammals face each year. However, this is the first year that we've moved it to its new home in the calendar in April. Previously, it was in the autumn. And one of the reasons why we've done that is because we're hoping to get people involved in a very practical sense. And April's a great time of year to be getting out and actually seeing what mammals are doing in your garden, your local area. So more on that very shortly. We would be making more of the fact that this is our 25th National Mammal Week, but we've got an even bigger celebration this year, which is the 70th anniversary of the Mammal Society itself. So that's what we're really celebrating this year. So things that you can get involved in National Mammal Week. Of course, you're here today for this lovely webinar with Fiona on small mammals. However, we've got a really packed program of free webinars this week. So do have a look if you haven't already signed up for any of our others, see what else is going on this week. And as with this one, they are all being recorded and they will be shared on our social channels and on our YouTube channel. Our theme for this year's National Mammal Week is rediscovering the world of forgotten mammals. So by that, we really mean the mammals that are overlooked, that are often under-recorded, or in some cases have already been lost from our landscapes. However, they're only lost from history if we forget about them and give up on the idea that they could return and contribute once more to a more balanced and biodiverse Britain. So we're looking at extinct mammals, overlooked mammals, under-recorded mammals. And of course, mammals, although they're often the poster children for wildlife in Britain, they're prominently featured in wildlife magazines, nature organization communications, children's book characters, fashion, and so on. Real mammals are the kind of wildlife that people don't often experience on a day-to-day basis. They're largely nocturnal, they're very elusive, so they can often be overlooked, and we can not necessarily have a very clear picture of what's going on in our landscape. So we might love the idea of mammals, we might love the creatures themselves, but we might not actually see them, we might not actually know what's going on. So that's something we're really hoping to change generally, but especially in National Mammal Week. So if you are interested in getting involved practically, do sign up for our Big Mammal Challenge that's running all this week. What we're asking people to do is just get stuck into mammal monitoring in their own homes, in their own gardens, in their own communities. There's some really easy things you can do, and all the instructions for how you can get involved are on our website. So mammelsociety.org.uk/. National Mammal Week with hyphens in between the words. I'll share that at the end as well. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our guest speaker, which is the wonderful Fiona Mathews. Fiona is the founding chair of Mammal Conservation Europe, a former chair of the Mammal Society, trustee of the Kasanka Trust, and co-founder and director of Ecotype Genetics Limited. And Fiona's popular science book, Black Ops and Beaver Bombing: Adventures with Britain's Wild Mammals, was published in April 2023. And if you haven't read it already, I thoroughly recommend it. It's very entertaining. So I'm going to pass over to Fiona, who's going to talk to us today about Britain's smallest mammals and their role in our ecosystems. So I shall pass over now. Are you all right to share your screen, Fiona?
Yep, I will.
Fantastic.
Okay. Hopefully you can see that. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
that's
It's
right.
Yep. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much, Matt, for that lovely introduction, and welcome to National Mammal Week. Um, when I was given the invitation to participate in this series for Mammal Week, I had a little think about what to talk about and thought that actually a topic that's very close to my heart, which is small mammals, would be a good place to kick off the series. Because, in my opinion, we overlook small mammals at our peril. And I remember years ago when I joined the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at Oxford and expressed an interest in working on small mammals, a number of other people kind of sniggered slightly and said, they're just prey. And while people were focusing on, things like big carnivores. So what I'm going to do now is basically give a shout out for small mammals, think about what the status of them is at the moment, why they matter, and what we need to be doing about them. Okay, and I should say before I start that I only got back from Zambia at 7 p.m. last night, so forgive me if I am slightly slower than I might ordinarily be. I'm still slightly dazed. Okay, what are our small mammals looking like? Well, basically, the news is not terribly good. If we look at trends since 1970, this is trends in occupancy. There's basically been a progressive decline. And what we mean by occupancy is if we go back to a particular hectare, a 1 by 1 kilometre hectare plot, and look at what the probability of finding a particular species was in 1970 and compare that with what it was in 2018, which is our census cutoff, we can look at how those probabilities change over time. Now, in doing occupancy modelling, one of the things we have to think about is, okay, there might be changes in observer effort over that period. Perhaps people are more likely for. And recently, we've developed some methods of accounting for that change in probability of actually something being spotted and reported. And the way that we do that is we consider the probability of seeing species A if species B, C, D, or E are also present in that place. So in other words, it allows us to infer negatives from our what tends to be a citizen science data set. So just to draw a contrast, we can do simple occupancy measures with something like otters, where we have systematic surveys done by professionals every year, and we can just take the raw numbers and compare the proportion of occupied sites in one year with another. When we're dealing with things like our small mammals, which tend to be done by volunteers, and we don't know whether the same sites are systematically surveyed over time, we can do that by applying this new methodology and basically infer that if somebody reports having seen a pygmy shrew, then it's likely that they were surveying at the same time for other species and would have reported something like wood mice or bank voles had they been present. Okay, so much for the methodology. The bottom line is that over those that period, we've had roughly a 25% decline. Now, to me, that's something very worrying, and I'm sort of baffled, to be honest, about why this isn't generating more concern than it appears to have done this far. And if we dig into those trends, then we can look at all these species, which are ones that we could reasonably expect would be surveyed at the same time, and therefore we can generate good data about them. And we can see that the bank vole is decreasing, common shrew decreasing, field vole decreasing, harvest mouse strongly decreasing, water shrew decreasing, wood mouse stands alone in no change, and yellow-necked mouse seems to be showing a small increase. I think the wood mouse no change reflects the resilience of that particular species. Certainly my own surveys on places like university campuses suggest that they can hang on at times when other species that perhaps have more specialised requirements have long since gone. And particularly male wood mice seem to be able to survive in even the kind of scrubbiest, most rubbish habitat around. Okay, but everything else, oh, the yellow-necked mouse, I think that may well be an artifact of survey effort in areas adjacent to its previously known range. But for all the other species, our patterns are ones of downward decline. And I just want to dig in to give you a bit more example, because on these graphs, our scale is kind of compressed because we wanted to show everything on the same scale, where 1 is present and 0 is absent. And if we just drill down a bit and look at the data just for the field vole, so in 1970, this species would have been found in about 75% of places where surveys were conducted. And that's gone down to about 50% in 2018. So that equates to a fall of about a third. I would incidentally recommend heartily that you go on to the Mammal Society website, because all this was work that I was involved with while I was at the Mammal Society and with other Mammal Society staff. And we made, or more accurately, Beth Smith cleverly made an app where you can go and actually explore the individual occupancy trends for each species, not just small mammals, but all of our British wildlife that we could analyse. And you can play around with the scale on the x-axis there to get a better impression of the trend. Okay, so 33% decline since 1970. For the species that's meant to be Britain's most abundant mammal, I mean, isn't that just terrifying? I think it is, at least. There are some species that we couldn't do occupancy modelling for, but where other data exist. One example of this is species-specific data on hazel dormouse that's collected annually as part of the People's Trust for Endangered Species Dormouse Nest Box surveys. And what this graph is showing is it trends in numbers of individuals of dormice found in their nest boxes. And the analysis is taking account of the fact that not identical numbers of nest boxes are surveyed in every year. But nevertheless, it's showing a 75% decline in abundance since the year 2000. So that's an extremely strong trend indeed. And incidentally, one that contrasts with most of the rest of Europe, where the hazel dormouse is not considered to be of any particular conservation concern. For water voles, again, it's because this species occurs primarily in riparian habitats, it tends to be reported on its own. We wouldn't expect it randomly to turn up in a Longworth trap, perhaps, that we'd set to try and survey field voles and common shrews. So we've had to look elsewhere for data. And again, we've gone back to occupancy, and it appears that there's been around a 50% decline in occupancy between 1998 and 2016. And you can see there, this is an extract from our Atlas, a project that Derek Crawley of the Mammal Society was leading on. And all those red downward facing triangles are places where the species has disappeared since between 1960 and 1992. Okay, and basically that trend continued over time. So there's a lot more red now, which again is deeply worrying. What's even more worrying is if you think about the long view here. So what I've been talking about so far are relatively recent changes. So changes over the past 30 years or so. If we flip back and think what the British landscape historically would have looked like, um, Don Jeffries estimated that there were billions of water voles present in the Mesolithic. Okay, that's quite an astonishing thing to realise. 6 to 7 billion water voles in the Mesolithic, compared with our estimate of about 132,000 now. Our maximum guess puts them at maybe around 330,000. So if you think of the ratio of one species or the historical numbers compared with now, that means there must have been something around 53,000 water voles historically to every one water vole now. Now, okay, you might be thinking, well, where on earth do those numbers come from the Mesolithic? It's very hard, the fossil record's patchy and so on. Yes, it is. And even though if we were to knock off, several noughts off those original estimates, you can still see that we're way, way below historical numbers. Okay. And I think it is worth taking that long view. And perhaps one of my gripes with red lists is that they're only looking at very short-term changes. So a red list assessment period is just 10 years or 3 generations, whichever is the shorter period. Because what they're looking for is species about to go extinct at any moment now. But I think there's a real need to also take that longer view, because in the case of all our small mammals, none of them are, well, none of the voles and the shrews would qualify as threatened under red list criteria, because although they've got this 33% decline, it's over a period of about a period since the 1970s. Okay, it would only be things like dormice that classified as threatened. But nevertheless, if your trajectory is one of slow, steady, sure, continuous decline, then sooner or later you're going to reach the bottom of the hill, maybe not quite as fast as the hazel dormice, but you will follow it there. So I think we need to take that broader view and say, okay, it's time we started doing something about this. And if we think about what are the major causes of decline, you can see that compared with our Mesolithic landscape that we might envisage there, there've been major changes during the Green Revolution, the change to high input agriculture. So, for example, we think about the loss of field voles. Field voles are highly dependent on structured grassland, tussocky grassland in particular, that provides them with the cover that they need to survive. And the change to the production of silage, as I think being one of the major and yet really unsung causes of biodiversity loss in Britain as well as across much of Northwest Europe. So, rather than tussocky grassland that you turn your cattle onto periodically, now you've got maybe 4 or 5 cuts of grass a year. And I know around me, I live in the west of England in a pastoral area, and the farmers are already out making their silage cuts, and often from seeded grass lays, which, are then ploughed up periodically, just like any other agricultural crop. Okay, there's also been changes with the loss of things like hedgerows, the loss of marginal habitats at the corners of fields have become larger and so on. Land drainage, I would say, has been another major driver. And again, it seems to me remarkable that I don't see any prescription in the current environmental land management strategy. It's known as ELMS in the UK, which has replaced our previous agricultural payments as we came out of the Common Agricultural Policy. I don't see anything there that's directed towards re-wetting of land. Wet pasture is a vanishingly scarce habitat, wet woodland even more so. Okay, there are a very small number of schemes. One is on Exmoor, for example, that's particularly about re-wetting of uplands. There's a little bit on re-wetting of peat bogs in Scotland. But as far as the wider agricultural landscape is concerned, land drainage is still very much on the agenda, with subsidies available for replacement of land drains, and lots of statements from government about, the terrible state of land drains in agricultural habitats and how they need to be repaired. There's also been change in structures of woodland, particularly the loss of older trees and standing deadwood. We know that there's changes to woodland understory, some of that probably driven by changes in the numbers of deer present in our woodland as well. There's very widespread use of pesticides, which is almost like, well, it's pretty likely to be having an effect on our insectivores, particularly our shrews, because it's going to affect the availability of prey. Although, having said that, there's been very little monitoring of those impacts. And finally, I put it there because we don't really know about the impacts of cats on our small mammal populations in Britain. There's widespread evidence from elsewhere that cats play an important role in limiting small mammal populations. And I would expect there could be population level impacts on things like dormice. Certainly, again, around where I live, it's not infrequent for my neighbours to report that their cats are brought in dormice. So if you've got a species that is breeding relatively slowly and is already sitting on a knife edge, then the additional pressure from cats could be significant. Okay, so let's think a bit about why small mammals might matter. And I want to preface this by saying I firmly believe that our wildlife matters in its own right. And it always makes me feel slightly uncomfortable to have to make an ecosystem services argument for them. But nevertheless, I'm going to plough ahead and do that. And if you want to know more about why I think animals just deserve to be in our ecosystem, do read the book, which is coming out in paperback, I should say, 2nd of May. So available even more cheaply for you, hopefully entertaining. Okay, so we know that we're in a crisis with our soil quality in Britain, and DEFRA has produced a strategy for what needs to be done to safeguard soil. And across the UK, I take this from a government document, almost 4 million hectares of soil are at risk of compaction. Over 2 million hectares of soil are at risk of erosion. Intensive agriculture has caused arable soils to lose about 40 to 60% of their organic carbon. Okay, there is a huge crisis basically in soil health. And I find it quite interesting because when I was at university, the soil science department was actually being closed down. So I was one of the last cohort to actually, as part of my biology degree, to do studies of soil quality, organic matter, water holding capacity, and so on. And suddenly now there's a crisis and everybody's talking about it as if nobody had ever thought of this before. They had thought of it. It's just that people somehow forgot in the interim. Okay. So let's have a look at why there's a crisis in soils. Well, one is that field sizes have increased, hedgerows have been lost, and we're using ever increasing sizes of machinery on farmland. Okay, so tractors have doubled in weight since the 1950s. And it's well known that the movement of heavy traffic across farmland has a very significant impact on productivity and soil compaction. And basically what I mean by compaction is it's the squishing together of soil particles. So if you imagine your soil particles are at the left here on this image, and Here we've got a root of a plant growing through the soil, finding nice little air gaps through which it can go, and through which water can percolate to drain the soil. After only one pass of a tractor, this is what the soil looks like. So suddenly everything is being compressed together, okay? And it means that it's very difficult for roots to penetrate, and it's also difficult for water to drain through. And it's not just agricultural mechanization that's changed, but also there's been a massive change in the way in which livestock are farmed. So we know that there's more issues with the poaching caused by livestock. So basically, breeds are heavier, and although overall the numbers of cattle are declining in the UK, we know that herd sizes locally are increasing, and the density of animals per unit area is increasing. Okay, so if you have a lot of cattle, perhaps particularly using areas adjacent to feeding troughs, you can get basically the soil becoming a complete mess. It's very hard. The water doesn't drain through it. You lose your tops, you lose your surface vegetation, and so on. Okay, so this is a publication from Tony Brazier, from Richard Brazier's group at Exeter, showing that basically each hoof print basically reduces the porosity of the soil, and at the surface of the soil, it reduces the ability of water to drain through. So what's the impact on this? Why should we care? Why does the government care? And clearly, suddenly, it does. And basically, it's because there are really profound impacts for agricultural productivity. We know that there's a decrease in plant growth, a decrease in photosynthesis, and a decrease in dry matter production. Okay, so overall productivity goes down, negative effect on sustainability and on food security. We know also there's a decrease in profitability of farms. We know that root growth is restricted, the rooting depth is restricted, and in some cases, root growth is stunted. Now, we also have to bear in mind that at the same time, water supply is becoming more erratic during the summer. So if you've got roots that are only very shallow, and then you have a period of drought, which because of climate change is becoming a more common phenomena, then what you get is stunted growth. Similarly, if you get a period of extreme rainfall, again, these extreme weather events being more and more common as a consequence of climate change, what's happening is the water is sitting on the surface and it's not penetrating through the soil. Okay, so we get this alteration in the soil physical properties, the soil structure. Basically declines in quality. And finally, you get a decrease in the availability of nutrients and also restricted uptake of nutrients by the plant. Okay. So if you look at the figure on the right, this was quite a nice thing I found on the growth of field maize, basically showing the contrast. So this is on level ground, showing the height of field maize grown on uncompacted soil versus compacted soil. Okay. So it just so happens that there's a really interesting review in the Mammal Society's journal, Mammal Review, looking at what they describe as beta mammals. So basically, these are small mammals that burrow. And almost all of our small mammals do burrow. I'm going to set aside hazel dormouse just for a little while. Okay. And what this review did was it looked at the evidence. This is global evidence because we don't have it. I'll make clear from the start, we don't have enough evidence on each of these things individually from the UK. But what we can say from a global literature review is that where you have burrowing small mammals, they alter the soil structure and help to address issues of compaction. So the presence of small mammals can increase root penetration, it can increase the establishment of seedlings, and it can ameliorate the effect of livestock trampling of pasture. Okay, and how are they doing that? Well, basically because they're disrupting the soil. They're turning over the soil layers. And if you think of the mounds of soil that are produced, for example, outside molehills, or the smaller mounds that are produced by something like a bankfold burrow, that soil structure is much more favourable to the establishment of seedlings than would be a squashed bit of soil that you just stepped on. Okay. In addition, the animals are themselves transporting seeds around, which again helps to increase regeneration. Okay. The small mammals are also aiding water infiltration and benefiting the moisture of the soil. And this is a picture of the Culm in Devon, where there's a lot of work being done on trying to restore Culm grassland with the idea of improving water storage and also improving biodiversity of the region. They're not, as far as I know, doing any specific work on small mammals, but it'd be really interesting if they did. And what small mammals can do is basically break up the top crust layer of soil, and those top layers are often very hydrophobic. So if you think about if you've got a clay soil maybe on your garden, in your allotment, and you think about what happens when you pour water on it in a drought period, what you'll find is that it just runs off. Okay, the same happens in sandy soils. You can actually get sort of a crust on the top. And what the small mammals are doing when they're burrowing is they're actually turning those top layers round and bringing up to the surface some of the more humus-rich soils, which are much more capable of absorbing water. It's a bit like if you had spread perhaps some compost from your compost bin on the garden and dug that in lightly. What happens is you there are artificially creating a substrate that's much more likely to absorb water and it won't just run off. Well, the small mammals are doing basically the same thing for you. Okay, so it's reducing runoff and it's reducing the amount of water that's just standing on top of land as well. It helps to increase the soil moisture, and there's also evidence for improved seed germination, basically because it's providing a moist environment, which is what seeds require to germinate, as well as some of that seed movement that I discussed earlier. Small mammals are also important in nutrient cycling. So one of the main ways in which they do this is they're carrying down materials from the surface of the soil, things like dried up leaves or chewed up pieces of grass. And they're doing that because they're using them to make nests with. Or in the case of some of our insectivores, they're taking animals that would be surface dwelling, so they're taking some of the invertebrates and carrying them down underground, where they then eat them, and they obviously produce urine and feces underground, which then places those nutrients underground where plant roots can get at them. Okay, in addition, any mounds of soil coming out from burrows actually bury the surface organic matter as well. And we know that buried litter decomposes faster than litter, the vegetation litter that's just left on the surface. And that's probably because they have, oh, I've got a typo there, a greater exposure to microbes and to different fungal communities underground. They also have more moisture available, which helps the breakdown process. And they're protected from ultraviolet light, which can kill off some microbes and fungi. Okay, so basically, where you've got a rich small mammal community, you've also got faster decomposition of litter layers. This actually has a knock-on effect that's been looked at in some parts of the world where there are problems with fires, because it's known that basically dry matter, dead vegetation, dry matter like leaves sitting on the surface of a habitat can really increase the risk of wildfire, because those are the things that are catching a light and burning very rapidly. And having good small mammal communities can actually help to act as a fire break. Okay, another way in which they assist in nutrient cycling is, at least in Northwest Europe, there are many areas where you get a layer of acid-rich topsoil. okay, which can then restrict the availability of things like calcium and magnesium and phosphorus. And that's one of the reasons why people undertake things like liming activity to try and counteract the effect of this acidity at the top. And again, what the burrowing animals are doing is they're just turning everything around, so they're stopping that buildup of the acid, the very acidic top layer, which you'd often associate with peatlands, but also a lot of woodlands as well, where you get leaf breakdown and leaching. You tend to end up with an acid top layer. And as I said before, the urine and feces of the animals also can create sort of mini nutrient hotspots in the soil, which can be very helpful to germinating plants. What about carbon storage? Now, this is an interesting one, and it's something that not a great deal of work has been done on, but there has been some really neat work looking at the black-tailed prairie dog, which is why I've got a prairie dog. Obviously not found in the UK, but the idea is that because they're pulling plant litter down into the burrows, when it releases the soil, it releases carbon as carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is being utilized within the soil by the mycorrhiza and fungal communities in the soil. They're being incorporated into plant roots and so on, and not lost directly into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So there's actually a strong positive effect on carbon storage of having those nutrients pulled down into the lower layers rather than just decomposing on the surface. So I think that's something, I mean, we know that there's a massive storage of carbon in grasslands in particular, and it's one of the great understudied carbon sinks. So I think this is an area really to watch going forward. And I was fascinated in preparing this talk to discover that there are actually devices being marketed to essentially try and reproduce what small mammals will do for free. So there's something actually called a beam mole plough, where it's putting something called a mole drain into the soil. So basically you pull, this is your tractor going on, and it's pulling a narrow blade with a torpedo shape on the bottom to try and create these small holes and channels, which are going to replicate the activities of things like moles, small mammals, and worms. And, you know, I think we need to have a long, hard look at ourselves. If, you know, on the one hand, we know that there's lots of activity to reduce our small mammal communities in farmland because they're seen as being a pest. And I do appreciate that some people amongst you might be thinking, oh, we might get Clostridium in our silage if you can get soil from molehills in it. Well, that's true. But on the other hand, you know, maybe we need to be thinking about our cutting height of our grass and things like that. So to me anyway, it seems very sensible that we should start evaluating the impact of our small mammals on soil drainage rather than reaching for an artificial solution like this one. And I was even more depressed to see this is a recent report of a school in Wiltshire that tackles a mole infestation by using artificial grass. And okay, I can see on the football pitch that might be a problem, but on the general playing field, really? You know, I think having some moles around is by no means a bad thing. Okay. Now, we also shouldn't forget that our small mammals, as was said to me by that person at Wild Crew, they are prey. And again, you know, we need to consider that field voles are meant to be our most abundant species. And you should be able to go to grasslands like the photo in the middle and find run upon run of field voles in tussocky grassland. And you know, those are providing a prey base for a very, very wide range of species. We know that kestrels will eat 4 to 8 voles every single day and more in the nesting period. And it's a bit sad, isn't it, that the main place where we can now spot kestrels is on places like motorway verges that haven't been particularly heavily managed, and they're gone from much of the rest of the landscape. Of course, there's other species as well, barn owls, many of our small mustelids, which incidentally are also in strong decline as far as we can tell from our occupancy modelling. You know, basically the things that are depending on small mammals are declining alongside the small mammals. And before we leave the provision of habitat for other species, we should also remember things like bumblebees. Now, Save the Bees really caught the public imagination in a way that I don't think Save the Small Mammals has. I don't know whether there's too many words in it. I don't know, maybe Matt and others at the Mammal Society, you can come up with some clever way of marketing small mammals to the great public. But bumblebee nests are most commonly found in abandoned small mammal burrows. They're not the easiest thing to find, but at this time of the year when queens are emerging, they can be tracked, and you'll find that 9 times out of 10, the place that they will be heading will be a small mammal burrow. And the reason for that is bumblebees make rather large brood chambers and they prefer to be underground. And yet they have really weedy little legs. Their front legs are too weak to burrow out their own hole, and so they make use of a hole that's being provided by somebody else. Now, there's lots of resources online telling you how you can create your underground bumblebee nest involving complicated tubes and sinking wooden boxes and burying them in the ground. How about we just encourage everybody to tolerate the small mammals in their back garden rather than be poisoning them? And I think actually the use of pest control particularly in a domestic situation is something, again, that we could be more forceful in having a message about, that I think a lot of people don't distinguish, and certainly the methods of capture don't distinguish between one species and another. And I think many times when people feel that they have a pest problem, actually probably what they've got is just a few wood mice in their back garden and nothing more. I mean, we know from our work at our colleagues working on garden dormouse in Germany that they're a really major cause of fatality in garden dormouse seems to be accidental capture in traps that are laid for other species. So, you know, a number one step is to say, actually, please, can you just stop using these things in your back garden? You've got a lot to gain and very little to lose. Okay, so I'm going to finish now by thinking about what we should do. And the first and most obvious thing is we need to reconnect habitats from which our small mammals have been depleted. So one of the issues is where we've got patches of suitable habitat that are not structurally connected. So we've ended up with isolated patches like those shown in blue at the top here. And we can do that either by creating ones that are by connected patches. So that might be by planting very favourable habitat in between. If we're thinking about something like our harvest mice, we know harvest mice have been really affected by the change in agricultural practice of moving from summer harvested, summer grown sown wheat through to winter wheat. Now, the issue with winter wheat is its stalks are short and it gets harvested by combine harvester at a time when the harvest mice would have their brood still in the nest. Okay, so the traditional idea of a harvest mouse being something that's found in your waving wheat fields is probably long gone. But we know that harvest mice can do very well in areas around the periphery of farmland, in basically any tall grassland or tall habitat involving ruderal weeds, things here like that one I think is on a hogweed bract. Anything that has sufficient structure to support a harvest mouse nest is suitable. Things like reed beds as well. But we know that at the moment, those habitats can be very fragmented in the landscape. So if we start to connect them back together, it's going to provide a means of having more resilient populations. Another thing that we can do is, even if we don't provide habitat suitable for breeding in, we can provide habitat that is sufficient that the animals are not just going to die when they're trying to traverse it. So as illustrated in the diagram below, where we've got pale green, it's basically a permeable land use. Okay, so it's not perfect, it's not the place these animals are going to want to breed, but it's better than the dark green here, which is basically impassable. So you're restoring some sort of functional connectivity of the landscape. And again, this is going back kind of 20 years to when Merrill Gelling and I were looking at structural connectivity of hedgerows in the landscape, and basically found that the numbers of connections were really critical in indicating the population size of small mammals. I think the next thing, though, that we need to do is to be ambitious about the scale of our efforts to restore habitat and species. And these figures both come from the 2018 review of the conservation and population status of British mammals that I led. And the thing that I want to point out to you is the importance of 2D as opposed to linear habitats. So this is the proportion of the total UK population size of bank foals up the side, with the different habitats shown along the bottom. Now, obviously, there's differences between the habitats. So broadleaf woodland supports a higher population of bank voles than do gardens or do coniferous woodland. But the really noticeable thing is the role played by hedgerows is perhaps lower than you might otherwise have expected. The same is true if we look at something like common shrew, where we've got about, what's that, 35, 6% of the population is found in bog, and about 25 or 22 in unimproved grassland, fewer in gardens and so on. But you've got to come down over to here to find the contribution of hedgerows. And the issue with the linear features is that even a good hedgerow is only providing perhaps 4 metre width of suitable habitat multiplied by whatever length it is. So in terms of a field, if you can imagine wiggling all your hedgerows backwards and forwards to form a 2D area rather than a linear feature, the amount of area provided by it is really rather small. Okay. Which brings me to my final, I'm going to use this as a case study. Just a final thought on restoration of habitats for waterfowl. And the reason I choose waterfowl is they are one of Britain's fastest declining mammals. We're doing an extraordinary job of sending them to extinction. And I think we need to move really fast. You know, when I was first doing my postdoc, everybody was talking about water voles. That was in the 1990s, and it feels very much like we keep vaguely talking about them and then we kind of forget about them again. Water voles are critical. They are massive ecosystem engineers. You know, think back again, that ratio of 53 or whatever it was, 53,000 water voles historically to the current one. Think about the prey base that would supply to your foxes, your small carnivores. Think about the impact on the water holding capacity of the landscape of all those water vole burrows. Think about the impacts on soil compaction and soil quality. You know, all of these things are absolutely massive. Now, what do we know about water voles? Well, we know that they thrive in places that have deep bankside vegetation. So places that look like this. And some really nice work from Merrill Gelling again was showing that basically the wider the width of your bankside riparian vegetation, the more water voles you're going to have. And I should say that those habitats are also ideal for many of our other declining small mammals, things like the shrews, for example. The problem is, though, that most of our landscape doesn't actually look like that. It has issues with American mink. This is some work we did, again, Mammal Society work, looking at the presence or absence of mink on waterways in Wales. And you can see basically they were present just about everywhere. And also, this is a view of the river just down the road from me in Devon. and showing just the most extraordinary levels of A, soil compaction, and B, complete depletion of any bankside vegetation because of the action of cattle grazing. In addition, this area is very prone to severe floods and water fluctuations, which that's a consequence of a whole raft of other things. The straightening of waterways upstream to try and get the water. We're pretty close to the sea, and the idea is to get the water off the land and out to the sea as quickly as possible. But the consequence of that is basically the bankside vegetation is completely scoured away, and it becomes more and more extreme as we get these extreme weather events from climate change and so on. Okay. So, rule number one, restore your bankside vegetation and do it in quantity, because the more you have, the better your voles will do. The next thing, though, is I'd like just to take you to a trip to what I think is one of the most remarkable successes of conservation in the UK. And it's remarkable because of its location. Again, you can find out more about it in Black Ops and Beaver Bombing if you want. So this is the East End of Glasgow, where there is a remarkable population of fossorial water voles. Fossorial water voles are water voles that are perfectly happy to live away from water. And when they're away from water, again, they're doing all those functions which are carried out by other burrowing small mammals, so alleviating soil compaction, helping nutrient cycling, providing prey for a wide range of species, and so on. Now, fossorial water voles are not a different species from riparian water voles. They're the same. They can interbreed. And in fact, in the UK, we've probably got two different races of water voles, northern ones and southern ones. But across Europe generally, and if we trace those races back, the races have within them some populations that are fossorial and some that are riparian or aquatic versions. Now, you can see that these water voles are living in very close proximity to people. As you can see, the big high-rise towers there. And what they're looking for are basically these stands of grassland that for some people are unsightly, it's overgrown, it's unmanaged, but it's an absolute haven for wildlife in there. And again, it's not just the water voles that are in there, it's the bumblebees and everything else. And if you go and poke around, so these water voles were first of all mistaken for rats, but fortunately somebody noticed that the droppings weren't quite right for rats. They look more like Tic Tacs without pointy ends. And that, so what the pest control had been called in to control were actually these threatened water voles. And the water voles are absolutely beautiful. Many of them are black, as you can see here, and some of them are a more conventional brown colour. I don't know if the video is going to play. This is a Greg's Bakery here, Main Road here. I actually found a squashed and rather sodden water vole on the pavement. Nobody seemed to be taking any notice of it. And, oh, there it is. And just over the other side of the bus stop here was where we put our water vole traps. And within just a few minutes, water voles will obligingly throw themselves into your trap, searching for pink lady apple, which seems to be their particular favourite. And people all around were coming out saying to, "Oh, are you the water vole people?" To which we answered yes. And, you know, I was just amazed about the enthusiasm of local people for their water voles. They felt it was their little bit of wildlife. One of them even reported that they'd heard on Jeremy Clarkson that all the water voles live in the East End of Glasgow. I think Jeremy Clarkson was complaining about having to do a particular grant license application for work on his farm because water voles were there. But anyway, they were very proud of them. They also reported that they're eaten by foxes, that they're eaten by herons, and indeed we did see quite a lot of herons stalking around, predating them, but still they're thriving. So how can that be when on the linear features they're going extinct? And I think the reason lies in, let's go back to here, the reason goes back to the density. So these animals are living at very, very high densities. And they can do that because they have just basically more area to play with. And if part of the population goes extinct, they're readily recolonizing from other areas. And actually, if we think of the riparian waterfowl that are doing well in Britain, you know, you're thinking of places like Wickham Fen, for example, fens and other sorts of wetlands where you're getting you haven't restricted your animals to the thin tightrope where so many things can go wrong. We know that they can recolonize and they've got lots of options in which way they can go. Whereas the problem with linear features is it only takes one mink to come in and clear out a particular area. You've then cleared that patch. Then most of the intervening habitat is unsuitable because of engineering works, poaching, the rest of it. And little by little, all your populations down your riparian system go extinct. Okay, whereas I think the sheer numbers and area available makes the fossorial ones much more resilient. So basically, I'd like to finish. Oh, here's a cute waterfall, just because they are really beautiful. And people were also commenting on how beautiful they are, which indeed, you know, they look pretty much like a guinea pig, right? I think it's hard to be offended by a waterfall. And so, you know, just to start with perhaps an easy win, every urban centre in Britain has large areas of, you know, perhaps rather unprepossessing parkland, some of which would be eminently suitable for reintroduction of water voles. I would say in the first instance, perhaps stay away from agricultural land. We know that in continental Europe, water voles can cause havoc eating carrots and turnips and things like that. But if you're in something like a grassland region, there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't reintroduce large numbers of fossorial water voles, and perhaps that can be a lifeline for one of Britain's fastest declining species. I think I'm going to stop there, but I'd be very happy to take any questions that people might have.
That was fabulous. Thank you so much, Fiona. When the questions were slow coming in, I was delighted because I have so many of my own, but I'm going to just ask one and then yield to those that come in from the attendance today. So please do add your question. We've got a few in already, which we'll run through shortly. I just wanted to start. I had a bit of an eye-opening experience at the weekend. I went over to Isle of Wight, which is an island in the middle of the loch on which I live up here in the Highlands. And it was the first time I think I've seen a habitat where that kind of density of small mammal populations was actually, you know, present. And when you talked about, you know, we could have expected to have seen if we could travel back in time, you know, to pre-agricultural revolution. And of course now it's so unusual that it looks, you know, it seems odd. It seems like there's some kind of weird thing or some kind of, but there were voles everywhere across this kind of unmown croft, tusky grassland everywhere. They only have a small herd of cows, spends part of each year there just for a short amount of the year. That's it. And it was remarkable. So I just wondered two connected questions. One was, are we aware of any studies that have already taken place or case studies that could be studied of kind of those exemplar habitats where we'd be able to kind of demonstrate the value and the impact of having that level of density of small mammals? And the connected question is, do you think we should we be categorizing risk differently? So rather than just considering on a species by species level whether or not they're in danger of extinction because of the number that they have, should we instead be thinking about, are they in danger of not fulfilling their ecological niche?
Yeah. So really good questions. I think I'm not aware of, well, the only study I can think of that's looking at small mammal density in relation to some sort of big change is the PhD studentship that actually a former Mammal Society employee is currently doing in relation to beaver reintroduction, where she's looking at basically wetland restoration and looking at impacts on small mammals. I think there are lots of opportunities. It's occurred to me before that places like NEP or some of the other rewilding projects might be particularly interesting to look at. But I think it would also be good to look at impacts on these ecosystem services within functional agricultural systems as well. So, not just the sort of blue chip rewilded places. There's more work being done in continental Europe than there is here. Particularly looking at some of these issues, small studies at the moment, but beginning to think about things like water storage, carbon storage, those sorts of things. I mean, I think all of these are really hot topics. And, as I say, certainly it felt to me, in the 1980s, when I was beginning to consider doing wildlife conservation and became interested, it seemed to me that lots of people were studying small mammals, and then it was almost like that sort of fell off the radar as a thing that people did, and everybody became interested in doing, what ostensibly may appear to be more charismatic species. But I think the impact of bioabundant species on ecosystems is absolutely massive, and it's something that we ignore at our peril, really, because I think they do have a huge role to play, and we tend to sort of, because they're small, we forget, yes, they're small, but they can be extremely numerous, and therefore their role on ecosystems can be very large. I guess an analogous situation is something like the declines of starlings and sparrows and things like that. All the common and abundant small birds that people like Kevin Gaston have really been highlighting, that you ignore those at your peril, because they're performing such important functions in terms of seed dispersal, pest control. I didn't even get into pest control on my talk. So they're likely to have a massive impact, and probably more so than some of the rare species, the things we would love to have. We don't want to see dormice go extinct, but on the other hand, their role at a larger ecosystem level is probably much more constrained, because probably historically they've always been one of the rarer species, whereas things like water voles and field voles, I think, are the cogs that make the wheels turn.
Mm. Thanks, Fiona. And yeah, I think what you were saying there speaks as well to the point you made earlier about us needing maybe to do a bit of a context exercise on small mammals. I'm thinking of sort of Dave Golson's Silent Earth work, Silent Earth book, where he talks about the insects and
Yeah,
really tries to get
yeah.
people to think about insects. It's very
Yeah,
depressing.
yeah, and I think the thing that I've spoken to Dave quite a bit about this, and about what is it that can excite people and re-engage them with the topic. And obviously, in the case of bees, what they did was very much focus on the pollination services. Now, of course, anybody who knows about bees will know that it's only a fraction of them that in reality are providing pollination services, and a lot of them, you know, are just nectar robbers or various things. But you kind of get your message home by focusing on a few key points. So it may be, in the case of small mammals, it could be something like impact on soil health that might be the real driver that could shift them from. I mean, it's constantly been a source of frustration that they're not really included in any of the biodiversity indicators that government uses. And it's baffling that, okay, you've got farmland birds, good for them, but but small mammals aren't in there at all, when surely they must be at least as important. So I think, as I said at the start, it always makes feel to make a justification for why we should be interested in wildlife. But if, in the reality, if you want to get funding and government interest and policies that are favourable to wildlife conservation, I think having some of those arguments could be really valuable. And the Mammal Society could play a really pivotal role, I think, in encouraging research on some of these quite hot topics.
Fantastic. Right. I've got a couple of linked questions about because obviously agricultural land and management of it came up quite a lot there. So I'll ask these together. It's first of all, can you suggest any ways we could support farmers to farm more sustainably, particularly reducing compaction? And then linked to that, is the presence of small mammals ever compatible with the practice of ploughing?
Mm. Okay, both good questions. And of course, there is a lot of interest in farming systems that don't involve ploughing, with direct drilling and those sorts of things now, and concern about the impacts of ploughing not only on small mammals but also on other things. So we know, for example, that cockchafer numbers have basically gone through the floor. Cockchafers historically having been so abundant that they were widely considered to be agricultural pests, but really important prey species for a lot of birds and other things. And it turns out most of their life cycle is underground. So if you do deep ploughing, then it completely destroys their populations. So ways in which we can reward farmers, I think some of the things I would like to see in ELMS programs would be, there's a lot of debate about, should you have areas set aside for conservation or should things be integrated into the farm? I would say that there's probably room for both, because we know that small mammals can exist on farmland. So boundary areas are important, but also if there could be payments for actually setting aside larger areas, whole fields, for biodiversity, I think that would be really important, even if it's only on a rotational basis. So I kind of go back to ideas of old set-aside schemes where land was taken out of production for a fixed period. And we know that some of those did become very important for their small mammal communities. Not sure if that answers the question, but I think those would help. Another would be having schemes that encourage re-wetting, because we know that a lot of species like shrews particularly thrive in wetter areas. You tend to find them now in farmland. They're very often associated with things like wet ditches. Whereas actually what they need to restore sensible population sizes are probably the situations that you experienced when you went to Butte, Matt, where you've got, large areas of damp habitat, which provides a lot of food resource for them.
Excellent, thank you very much. Okay, we've got one more question in the Q&A from Michelle. On a harvest mouse survey a few months ago, thank you for doing a harvest mouse survey, we found a rugby ball-shaped nest within the grassland about 30 centimetres long by 20 centimetres wide, about 100 yards away from a lake. Could that have been a water bomb?
Could have been indeed. Could have been indeed. I mean, I find the whole issue of fossorial water voles just fascinating, because we don't really know why they do it. I guess that there's more food available, in that you've got a 360 degrees around your burrow that you can go to, and you don't have to travel as far. Imagine you're on a linear for you to have a fixed intake of vegetation. Achieve that within just a few steps of your burrow if you can go in 360 degrees around it. Derek Gow, who obviously does a lot of water vole reintroductions, comments that, in his experience, you can keep water voles perfectly happily away from water. And in fact, if you put a cage in grassland, then they'll just behave like any other burrowing. They basically behave like field voles and will adapt to that habitat. So it may well be more that by ploughing, ploughing is probably one of the principal reasons why we don't have water voles now in our don't have fossorial water voles in Britain, apart from these very restricted populations. There's a tiny population on Jura as well. But we know from the fossil record that they historically were found all over the place. There's good records of them on Salisbury Plain, for example, and lots of other locations that are very, very far from water. So clearly, historically, they haven't been water dependent. It's just we've come to associate them with water recently. So again, I think taking that long view of what have we lost and what should we try to get back to is very, very important.
And on that point, I think we'll have to draw this to a close.
Okay.
So much, Fiona. Such a rich
You're welcome.
topic, one that we will revisit and revisit. So it just remains for me to say a huge thank you to you, Fiona, for joining us today. And to recommend that everyone check out our website, mammalsociety.org.uk/national-mammal-week, to see all the other events we've got going on this week and to register for the Big Mammal Challenge, including small mammal monitoring in your own local area. But yeah, thanks very much, and we'll hopefully see you all throughout the week.
Thank you. Bye.